So yeah, we can start the recording later because otherwise that entire recording download would start from now.
Yes.
Yeah. Yeah, we can.
Hey Anupam, how are you? We need to catch up on a few. Many people are likely to join, Sumit?
Yeah, probably let's wait for a minute or two and then.
Okay. But you think how many people have signed up? You think is about what 40 or 50 or less than that?
No, we are close to 70, 80, more than 80.
So you tell me, you give me the signal for introduction.
No, absolutely. Will do, surely.
Akanksha, if you can switch on your video.
Raj, even if you could.
I think my video is switched on, right? You don't see it?
Yes, we do. Thank
Okay.
you. Thanks.
Yeah,
Thank
hello,
you.
Akshay. Yeah.
Maybe we can wait for another minute or so and then we start, if that's okay.
Yeah, sure.
Okay, so thank you. Thanks a lot, everyone, for joining. As you know, this is the third in the series that we have started. The new series is Green Future series. This is part of the IVCA Climate and Sustainability Council. So we'll be doing one series every month, and we have had two till now. The first one was on electric vehicles. The second was on air pollution, and the third one is on climate data and analytics. A very important topic, since anything and everything that has to be done in the climate change investing space, we need a lot of data, and that is where the entire investment opportunity part of it comes in, evaluation, post investment, and all of it. So we thought we should put this session together. So thank you all the speakers for joining us. So the session is divided into two parts. We have a talk by Sameer Shah, and then we'll proceed to the panel. So Sameer is managing partner at Peak Sustainability Ventures, also one of the first institutional sustainability VC funds in India. He's a veteran in the field of climate investing and has done numerous investments as well as achieved a lot of exits. He's a domain expert in energy, water, food system, plastics, and other chemical verticals. He has had a long illustrious career starting in 2014, and that was through his private investment office, Satwa, where he has invested in more than 30 companies across stages, sectors in the past 5 years. He has also been involved in, largely all sort of global public and private markets for the past 28 years. At the same time, he's also an adjunct professor at Ahmedabad University. He's teaching MBA course on sustainability. So Sameer, thank you. Thanks a lot for taking your time and joining us. And over to you. Would love to hear your thoughts.
No, thank you, Shumit, for that kind introduction. And good afternoon to all of you. Let me begin by thanking IVCA for giving me the opportunity to talk to all of you. I think the point you make, Shumit, is very important, which is that the role of data analytics in climate. So what I'm going to spend the next 15 minutes on is to talk about how we see data and data analytics as playing a key role in climate and how that can influence outcomes. I'll keep my comments general and make a few sort of remarks on the conceptual level and then talk through some examples of companies that we have seen in the space making a difference in terms of climate and in terms of achieving the desired outcomes. So let me just begin by saying that one of the key things about data and about one of the key aspects is that you cannot manage what you do not measure. This is also said by Pawan Sukhdev, the CEO of a company that I am on the board of. And the starting point of doing something about a particular subject matter is to begin with data and to begin with analytics. So the starting point is to say that, look, unless we have data, and the data can be, look, today the GHG emission levels or the total levels are 425 parts per million. And if that's the case, then, it triggers responses from people that we should do something about it. In Mumbai, last many days, the AQI index and pollution levels are bad. So everybody's focused on the level of, pollutants of PM 2.5. So data as a starting point to decision making is a core necessity. However, at the same time, you can't stop with the diagnosis. I mean, data can be an enabler, but unless you use the data to trigger action, you're not going to solve the problem. So the point I'm making is that you need to begin with data and data analytics, and that has to be sort of the basis on which you take actions in climate. That leads me to the second point, which is the comment made that what you measure determines what is important to you. And this is very important to understand that, look, till now, a lot of the measures, even by regulators or even in annual reports or even in governments, the focus, I would say, and I'm making an estimate here, were 90+% for only financial reporting. But now, even regulators, SEBI has mandated for the top companies to have reporting on impacts on environment, impacts on social impact, etc. Globally, standards are changing. What does that mean? What that means is that the data regarding climate is becoming important, and good companies move towards this before it becomes mandatory. I mean, that's basically what good citizens or corporate citizens do, that I don't follow regulations. I should be ahead of regulation in terms of determining what we need to do and what we need to measure. So the discussion has also shifted globally throughout the companies I'm involved in India and overseas, to say that, look, everybody talks about net zero on energy, net zero GHG emission, which is very important, very topical, and very necessary. But discussions on climate and data should not stop at just GHG emissions. There are broader measures of natural capital, which are well outlined in various reporting journals, but include how are you using water? What are you doing with waste? What is air pollution? What is happening to land use change? How are we dealing with water pollution? These are aspects that include and are inclusive of what I would call a broader measure, if you will, in terms of how do you think about climate? And you can't just reduce everything to a point estimate of GHG emissions. It has to be a broader aspect and a broader analysis. And I think what is very encouraging is that the measures are shifting from regulators, and now if you look at even in the last 2 years, the disclosures by some companies, and you look at anything prior to 5 years, you're seeing companies more and more sort of willing, able, and in some instances required by regulation to disclose the footprint that they have with various aspects of the environment, including water use, including energy, including renewable energy, and many aspects of how one uses the various resources. So that, to my mind, is very encouraging, because it is showing that we are measuring this because it is important to us. And it's important to us in 2 ways. One is obviously to know what the numbers are, and more importantly, to see what we can do about it, because that, to my mind, is actually the immediate next step to measurement. The third point I wanted to make about data was on the aspect of how does it help in decision making. And there, the one extreme is how AI and information that you have and information that it helps you analyze, allows decision making. And in the climate space as well, you have sensors, and the data on that can improve efficiency. You can have control. You can use measures to control temperature. There's a company that we know called Turntide Technologies that works on what is called switch reluctance motors. as opposed to induction motors. And there the software is driving the hardware in a way that data is driving the usage of energy with respect to an HVAC application that is being done. So there are, I mean, anybody, all the people on the call would have numerous examples as to how data as well as sort of sensors and the data taken from there, as long as it is intelligently analyzed and moved to decision making, can play a big role in terms of how that can enable changes to occur and how that can enable outcomes. And that comes to the more meaningful part of data, and that it is just not to be read. It has to be acted upon. And whenever you say data in decision making, to me, that is a lot more, a powerful statement than data for just knowledge. I mean, it's good, but the knowledge has to lead to action. You're not going to solve climate problems by just, knowing what the numbers are without doing anything about it. So I think increased deployment of devices, increase in the use of data, which leads to better decision-making in climate, in my mind, is going to drive the future. That's going to happen in an exceedingly, fast manner. And I think that will be discussed by the companies who are in the space and are on the panel that is following this talk. The other, important point about data that I wanted to just make is that, in the climate, particularly this has reference to the climate space as opposed to the data related to, like, for example, if I'm talking about, and I have a long career in financial markets. So when people talk about ROA, it is a clearly understood number. There's not much of an issue on what is ROA, ROCE, IRRs. They are practical. I mean, the numbers are very, immediately available in terms of how you calculate them. But when you move to climate, this is a new area and a new field where standards are developing. People are figuring out what is the right way to measure data. I mean, one example I can give you is, being at the World Economic Forum a couple of years ago, people were saying biodiversity is important. So it's important as a concept. But then you say, well, what is the data science that is emerging? And then there are two large, broad schools of thought. One is called PDF, which is not the file that you have, but it's called potentially disappearing fraction, if you will, in terms of how many species are getting sort of extinct. And the second is what is called MSA, which is like the mean species abundance, in the sense that if it was 500 per kilometer, is it going to 200 or 700? I mean, but these standards are evolving. But the point I'm making is that as these standards evolve and as the world tries to get a grasp in terms of how biodiversity or other areas of climate evolve, the fact that you cannot actually and adequately measure something, or that there are no accepted standards, doesn't mean that the risk doesn't exist. So one has to be very clear, particularly when we are talking about climate, that there are issues like, planetary boundaries, for example, where we talk about tipping points, where we say, look, everything is not linear. After you cross the tipping point, the results can be perhaps, in this instance, irreversible or disastrous, if you will. So these are aspects of climate that need to be factored in because it is a new science. It is an emerging science. Data is kind of catching up. Data is enabling better reasoning. But the lack of accuracy should not be a view that, look, till it becomes accurate, we won't act. Because then it may be too late to act, actually. So in a way of speaking, the two should be almost parallel in a way that, look, we are evolving the science. We know the risks exist. And as we evolve the science and as we agree on standards, obviously there will be sort of, a more of, I guess, a global standard that is established. But in the meantime, we should not forget about these risks. And then there is data in forecasting. We have Professor Tim Palmer from Oxford on our board, who uses this data to predict climate models 50 years ahead, 20 years ahead. And it's very useful speaking to him because he is like the biggest consumer of data, one of the biggest consumers of data in climate, using this data to see what the world will look like. And the reason that is also important is because that tells us to say what action can we do today to ensure that actually what is called in climate terms, bending the curve, in the sense that how do we work on climate mitigation and adaptation techniques. So I think without sort of getting too much into further detail, I think the message is, look, data is going to be crucial in climate. There are business models evolving around this. There's one of the companies we know and work with called Energy Web Foundation, and they are making carbon markets accessible by allowing verification of carbon marketplace. GIST and Anupam is more equipped to talk about that when the panel begins, but does impact intelligence globally for clients. And that is what is triggering action. Because once you have a diagnosis of a problem, it is much more likely to trigger action than if you don't know what it is that is. And now I'll end with the last couple of points and then leave it open to the panel. Is that when we talk about so much data, I think there is a feedback loop as well, where the more data we have, the more data centers we have. Today, storage of data takes 1 to 2% of global net energy. And to put it in perspective, steel is a user of about 8%. So 25% of what is the net primary energy used by steel is used in data centers. And we are storing more and more data. And a concept which is more used in energy called rebound effect, which is like when the cost of a service reduces, the usage increases exponentially, wiping out any savings. So the fact that data storage has become cheaper, perhaps full cost may or may not be factored in. There's a lot of storage that is going on. We have, like, I was just reading up this number before of this call, about 6.7 zettabytes of storage globally, going to 16 by 2025, which means that we have to ask ourselves a question, not only from a climate standpoint, but overall, to say, is the data storing that we are doing, is it meaningful? Is it necessary? And if it is, we should certainly do it. Because otherwise, there's a feedback loop back and forth that what you do in data also affects the climate. And data servers take a huge amount of energy in terms of how they store data over a period of time that is continuous. Obviously, if you don't delete the data. And I want to just end by saying that, look, there are a number of business models around data which kind of work around, and the climate aspect of it is determining what is the action that one can take, what are the numbers, but the numbers are all to be interpreted in the right way to say, look, how do you build global standards? How do you build databases? How do you use this data to enable and trigger climate action that leads to a better future for all of us? This is very exciting for us. I mean, we look at these companies all the time and very keen to work with companies who are addressing this issue in a very meaningful manner. With that, I'll stop and keep it open to the panel and listen to the discussions that the companies involved in the space have to say in this. Thank you.
Right. Thank you. Thanks a lot, Samir, for a very insightful talk. And as you rightly mentioned, you need to measure anything and everything. So, that is where the interaction starts. So thanks a lot once again. From here, we'll move on to our panel, Managing Data and Climate Analytics. So we have 4 speakers here. Akanksha Priyadarshini, who is a co-founder and CEO of Aurashore, Anupam Ravi, SVP Client and Data Delivery, GIST Impact. We have Rajpai, Managing Partner of GF Capital, and Akash Shah, Partner, Peak Sustainability Ventures. Akash is also moderating the panel. So thanks, Akash. So over to you.
Thanks, Sumit. Appreciate it. And thanks, everyone, for joining. Very interesting thoughts by Samir. I'll just give a quick short background on everyone, and then we can get started in it. I'm a partner at Peak. We are early stage climate fund, as Smith mentioned, focusing on energy, food systems, water, and climate. And I've done sort of a lot in this space, and particularly mapped out the landscape in terms of how climate data and its relevant components, how they fit within the broader space. Akanksha is a co-founder of Aura Shore. It's a climate startup that uses data and innovation to drive actionable change, very much along the lines of what Samir is mentioning. They've successfully established a network of air quality, food, and climate data collection in 20 cities in India, working with industry leaders as well. Raj is one of the founders and managing partners of GEF Capital and co-leads its South Asia investment program. Has about 25 years of professional experience. GEF, as many of you know, is one of the early participants in the climate investing space for the past 15 years. Now has 3 India dedicated funds with over 700 million AUM. And lastly, Anupam. He heads investor services team at Just Impact, leading data and analytics provider in climate, and has been measuring and quantifying climate data for more than 15 years. They have a team of about 100 scientists, engineers, and data scientists as well. Thanks everyone for joining. Really appreciate it, and very interested to get this conversation going. I think going off of some of Samir's points, 2 key elements to this whole equation are getting very high quality data inputs, and then what do you do with them? So just starting off with the data input side, and perhaps I would direct this towards Akanksha and Anupam, but feel free to provide your thoughts, Raj. Is when you're thinking about high quality data inputs, which really determines then the quality of assessment and analytics, what are some of the ways to measure data better? How can we get corporates incentivized to measure their climate impact? And as Samir mentioned, it should really go beyond just GHG emissions. So what are you guys thinking about in terms of other important areas to measure? And I know Anupam focusing more on sort of corporate data and getting it directly from them. Akanksha a little more on the sensor side. So would love some thoughts around that.
Thanks, Akash. So I would like to start by quoting Dr. Robert Gunning. She is a consultant in microbiologist. So she mentioned that having accurate data is like a compass and a map if you're out in wilderness. So, I mean, you cannot navigate without having reliable data. So what we are doing is a top-down approach. We are using sensor devices to collect hyperlocal data from on-ground for various parameters like air, GHG, and as heat stress, flood, and other parameters as well, weather parameters and meteorological parameters. And after collecting this data, we have an AI/ML model which ensures that the data is collected in a highly reliable and accurate manner. So with this, we are able to provide a spatial map model for different organizations and businesses to take any decision based on the data that we are collecting. So ours is a different approach than the organizational manual data processing that Anupam is doing. So, and why, what is the process of having this kind of data collection is? So in a particular kind of a city or an industrial belt, so the corporation should have a fence line kind of a monitoring network. And also not only from the sensors, but there are other sources of data, like for example, satellite data is available. Some of the historical data are available, which also can be utilized to create this particular model for the decision-making system.
And thank you first of all, Akash and IVCA for this opportunity. To touch upon the data aspect, I think there's 3 attributes which are most important when it comes to from the perspective of financial institutions. So it includes quality of the data, recency of the data, and traceability of the data. So all these 3 aspects are equally important. And we have been tracking data of publicly listed companies. So we track almost 14,000 listed companies, and we have historical data starting 2016. The only way we have been able to achieve all these three aspects of quality, recency, and traceability is through use of technology. So we have automated cognitive search engine, which allows us to pull this information, store this information, and process this information in an automated fashion with very limited manual intervention. At the same time, we have approaches through which we use machine learning and AI models to train our models to gap fill any missing data points. So, a lot of companies do not currently disclose a lot of data points, and this is where these gaps need to be filled, and we use the machine learning models to fill those gaps. Other aspect which Akash just mentioned was on um, the spectrum of the data which should be captured. So um, the focus, yes, is definitely on GHG, but as Samir also touched upon, GHG is not the only material indicator. Whether we talk in terms of environmental impacts or social impact or human capital impacts, there are multiple indicators which are becoming really important for financial institutions. And for example, at just we have been capturing more than 50 such indicators. So not only GHG, but indicators across natural capital, human capital, social capital. And more recently, I think biodiversity has become really, really important aspect, which we are hearing from all the financial institutions. The exposure to financial institutions through risk from biodiversity and assets located close to biodiversity forms is going to become more significant, given that target 3 of global biodiversity framework has asked for increase in the conserved areas to almost 30%. Right now we are talking about 16% of land which is under conservation being increased to 30% in next 6 years. So that is going to put a lot of assets under close proximity to biodiversity sensitive zones and thus exposure to financial institutions as well. So I'll stop there and pass it over to Raj for your comments.
No, I think that's thank you, Anupam. So I'll just make a couple of comments on this. I think clearly what Anupam and Akansha do is very important, because you need to, as Samir said, what you can't measure, you can't improve nor monitor. So I think that's important. But I'll just maybe give a perspective more from a data user perspective, because now that's another important part, is how you use the data. So I think as GEF, so we invest across multiple sectors within climate. We have companies in manufacturing, in renewable, supply chain, in waste, in water, in food security, supply chain decarbonization. So I think the point I'm trying to make is, you're absolutely correct that there is no standard set of data that is equally relevant. The relevancy is very important. And I'll just give you a couple of examples to make my point. So we have a couple of manufacturing companies. For them, the relevance of data goes well beyond greenhouse gas emissions. So I'll just give you a live example. We have a company that did a physical acute risk analysis, and they found that the location they had cited to build a factory was the wrong location because of high risk of flooding and precipitation and all of that. So I think what you do with the data is equally important, if not the most important thing, because it has to be actionable. Because if you just get a GHG data by itself, it doesn't add any value to it. So I think that's my only point is, data is good, but it has to be relevant to a particular industry. What a manufacturing company thinks about a climate risk is very different than a food security company thinks about it, then different than what a company that invests heavily into supply chain. So I think the benefit we look at is we have a portfolio of over 20 companies in India. So we kind of see, each industry, each company thinks of data differently. That's the only perspective I can share here. Thank you. Akash, you're muted.
My bad, thanks. No, definitely agree. And I think each of you, both from an operator perspective as well as from an investor looking at portfolio companies and how they can use data to better manage and also monitor risks, is a key component of what you can do with that data. Like Samir mentioned, and as we know, I mean, I think knowing something, but then also going the step further and actually doing something with that. The organizations, the investors that are doing that in a more progressive manner, kind of before government regulation sort of steps in and forces people to do so, are the ones that will really win. And I think an important component is also how do you create this sort of supply chain or integrated manner in which you're using the data? Because in the past, we've sort of had companies where, okay, I'm using a particular data set, now I'm incorporating it into my business. But what you're starting to see is businesses incorporating that directly into their systems, either through APIs or by having sensor data flow back directly to them. So I guess just leading on from that question itself is when we think about sort of ways in which people will think about some of these risks, be it physical, financial, or social risks, as it pertains to company sectors and regions. I mean, you have all kinds of risks, sea level rise, extreme weather events, supply chain disruptions. I think, Anupam, from your perspective, how are you seeing corporates actually incorporate and do things with these? Akanksha, you work with people from Google and from other industry leaders like Honeywell, L&T. And then Raj, on your side, I think from not just a portfolio company, but an investor perspective, would love to get a sense as to how you guys are seeing climate data actually being incorporated into decision making.
Yeah.
Okay, if I may go first. So, Akash, as you rightly pointed out, and Raj also touched upon this point of risk. So, there are two sets of models or kind of analysis which is currently being used. One is to look into the inside out impacts of businesses. So, how businesses are impacting the outside world and what's your impact on the reality. So how you are creating problems for the society or the environment. And that is not only restricted to GHG emissions. If you are consuming a lot of water, if you are releasing a lot of air pollutants, releasing or disposing a lot of hazardous waste, it has impact materiality. It is going to have externalities, what is called as third-party impacts. And what we would do is we would use economic proxies to put a price on these externalities. So, if you don't measure the size of the problem which you are creating, it's very difficult for you to incorporate it in your decision making. So it's not only for GHG emissions. So for example, you can use social cost of carbon as economic proxy to value the impacts you are generating through GHG. But at the same time, you can use economic proxies for all the other drivers of impacts. So that's on the inside out model. But at the same time, there is outside in impacts, which is the physical risk analysis, where, which depends upon where your assets are located or where, from where you are getting your key raw materials and where your suppliers are located and how these assets are exposed to certain climate hazards, whether it's flood risk, hurricanes, typhoons, drought, forest fire has become really important now. So all these hazard categories are becoming really important, and we would use certain modeling techniques where first we need the hazard probability maps, which basically gives you an indication that what is the frequency of these events going forward in future as well, because we can have prospective maps for such. And we use exposure and vulnerability formulas to calculate the risk of exposure to all the businesses. So these are the two sets of key types of analysis, but both are interlinked. Your impact on the outside world will circle back as an impact to your business through financial materiality. So both are sort of sides of the same coin. I'll pass it over to Akash and Raj.
Yeah. Thanks, Anupam. I think Anupam mostly summarized why investors need to identify the climate risk before taking any major investment decisions. I just want to add, not only the financial institutions, for example, a company wants to set up renewable energy power plant in a city like Rajasthan, in a state of Rajasthan, where the sand dunes or heat stresses are quite high. So if we are setting up solar panels, so there are multiple implications apart from the physical risk from the climate. It actually depends upon it. It is very much correlated, and it should be correlated with the right use of data and the models to provide the risk for that particular project, the renewable project, the solar power plant project we're talking about. Similarly, for all other renewable hydropower plants as well. So if we don't understand those kind of risks, so how will we be able to move to the sustainability energy generation side? So these two are very much correlated, and for which huge amounts of data, not only whatever is available with us, but a robust infrastructure is required to understand this and manage better.
Got it. Got it. And Raj, I would slightly tailor the question for you because obviously both of us have a slightly different angle to this. And this would be much more around when we think about portfolio companies. When using this data and analytics to assess the performance of portfolio companies in more ways than just financial returns, you're seeing an incredibly sort of a much more significant amount of regulation as well as emphasis on how funds, especially within the climate domain, report back to not just LPs, but also think about their portfolio, what the impact of their portfolio is. And so I think one of the question, I mean, what's pretty obvious is that the analytics and data can be used to assess the performance. But I guess a second level question is what's reasonable to expect from companies, especially ones that are early on in their journey, for example, an Aura Assure, because obviously it takes time, it takes resources and certain other costs to implement these measurements. And then should the onus really fall on the investor or the portfolio company?
Right. No, I think many loaded important questions there, Akash. So I'll just take the first one. So I think I've had the benefit of actually investing in, sorry, many of our companies where we invested, they were small to medium-sized companies. And I could see it was a very different mindset. And now a few of them, or at least 3-4 of them have gone to become public listed companies. So I'll just use that as a paradigm here. So I'll tell you what, I think as a medium-sized company, it's often seen as a lot of burden, which is pushed honestly through the investor to the fund manager where, you have to do all this reporting and regulation. And there tends to be a little bit of, that's great, but is it tied to any financial reward or is it just purely from a downside risk mitigation? I'll give you one example. I think in the last 5 years, we are seeing a fundamental shift in that mindset, Akash. I think you know that the regulations globally, I mean, we are a global investor in US and LATAM in India, but we are seeing every regulator in the world, be it the US SEC or EU regulator to TCFD. There are so many frameworks coming online. Even SEBI is doing a fantastic job that the top 1,000 listed companies in India are mandated to report on the BRSR, the business responsibility such and a lot of, I would say 80% of BRSR report is non-financial. So I'll just give you an example. I think for all the, I would not say pushback, but all the pain a lot of our mid-market companies took, they are actually very happy and feel super well prepared ahead of, because they are required to do it now while they were not required to do it as a mid-market company. So all I'm saying is the mindset in India is shifting. It's partly defensively, partly offensively, right? Opportunistically, not offensively, but defensively, because I think, it lowers your risk from a regulator. You have to do it today or tomorrow. Opportunistically, I just want to put one more layer because as an investor, we also try to push companies to see, not just adhere to regulations, but see where you can benefit. I'll just give you one really good example that's fairly close to my heart, right? So many of our companies do a lot of export revenues. I would say about 50% of our aggregate portfolio revenues are export revenues to Europe or US. And there are phenomenal opportunities opening up. And that's the positive side of it, because there are many laws that are coming in. Like, you heard of this called carbon border, CBAM, carbon border adjustment mechanism. Effectively, all European importers would need carbon accounting for across the supply chain. And trust me, that you can't do that without analytics. I think Anupam is nodding his head. He's absolutely, about $100 billion of exports to Europe are going to be affected by this single clause coming online, I think Jan 2026, Anupam. So all I'm saying is we have a company which has really built 3 or 4 products ahead of the 2-year deadline. And effectively, half of their customer base has gone from 0 to 50% from the European customer. So all I'm saying is, if you play opportunistically, companies which are ahead of the pack actually see a huge financial benefit. So I think our job as an investor is to be very, we have to make sure the companies adhere because it's important, but we need to show the companies the path that this leads or this can lead to a financial benefit, because just being a stick doesn't work in this market. You have to show the carrot as well. And I think we are seeing it now, ever more so than in the last 3 years than ever before. So that's kind of the two sides of the coin here.
Yeah, no, I very much agree. And I think companies are also seeing that it will pay off in many more ways. It's not sort of just something that I have to that I have to adhere to purely from a regulatory perspective. But in many ways, actually building a business that is more sustainable in nature can actually pay off from a monetary perspective as well. I mean, we have a portfolio company called Indra Water that helps industries reuse very dirty wastewater back into their systems. And I think, I mean, obviously you're not also then taking up new groundwater. And so I think the overall assessment of the value chain and how you're incorporating these sustainable initiatives pays off in many ways, which is the reason why, I mean, as you mentioned, people ahead of the curve just as well. Now these corporates are seeing the benefits of making decisions based on impact data that goes beyond sort of just financial impact, but natural capital impact, social capital and whatnot as well. And I guess just there's one part that we had missed out a little bit, which is the investor versus portfolio company aspect. And I'm curious, given that both of you two are portfolio companies of certain investors, and we are two investors, where should the owners fall? I mean, should it be more on the portfolio company?
I'll give you a very diplomatic answer here, Akash. I think it's kind of a shared onus. So I'll tell you what. I mean, the onus starts with the investor because, you know, there's no better time than putting the onus than when you're investing in a company, because that comes with a fairly serious legal obligation. So I would say the onus starts on the investor first. But we have seen multiple examples where even if there is an intent with the portfolio company, unless you help build the capacity, there's no way. It's not for lack of intent, but you need to build capacity. So the best examples I can see in our companies where we build the owners as part of our investment, but then we immediately helped in 8 out of 10 companies in the last 4 years. We have immediately post our investment, we have brought in a chief sustainability officer as a requirement in the company, as a full-time employee within the company. And honestly, that's been the biggest difference, is to build the capacity inside the company, because I don't think as an investor, you can manage all these obligations through a shareholder agreement. And that's when I think the second part is the companies then start working with Anupams and Akanshas, because then they need to work with the vendors to collect the data. But I think it's a shared onus. I would not say it lies on one versus the other, Akash. I mean, if it lies only on the investor, I've seen many failures. If it lies only on I mean, it cannot ever lie on the company, because it has to start with the investor, but it has to be fulfilled by the company, but you need to build the capacity. I think 9 out of 10 companies I've seen in India don't have the capacity. It's not the lack of intent.
Yeah, of course. And I want to get both of your thoughts as well. But obviously, look, completely agree. It's not either or. Both have to work together in tandem. I guess if we took a more nuanced view, it's where should the push come from? Because while it is obviously investor, but I think portfolio companies as well, they have a certain product that they're putting out in market, limited resources and bandwidth, right? So for instance, when the investor will be like, okay, I'm coming in, but in addition, build out the capacity to measure these 3 other things that are indirectly related to your business. Then I'm curious, in fact, Anupam or Akanksha, I mean, what are some thoughts around this and building some of those other frameworks? I know you guys both provide a lot of data to other companies, but what about internally and measuring that?
So, Akash, if I can touch upon what I'm already seeing, what's happening in Europe. So the onus is being, so the regulators are pushing on both the sides, both on the corporates as well as financial institutions. So we have CSRD, which will be applicable starting 2025, which will mandate all kinds of disclosures, more than 80 mandatory disclosure points for all the companies. And it applies to more than 50,000 organizations in Europe. Starting 2025 January, it is applicable. So the corporate side is covered there with CSR. And at the same time, we already have SFDR regulation, which mandates the financial institutions to report the same numbers, but at an aggregated level for their portfolios. So the numbers which the corporations will be disclosing will be eventually will be used by the financial institutions. So as Raj mentioned, that it is a shared responsibility, but the first initiative has to come from investors. That that push has to start from investors, and also from the point of view that going forward, as we move forward, more and more of ESG indicators will become part of the financial reporting itself. And that's what the direction looks like. The IFVI, the International Foundation for Valuing Impacts, is pushing for incorporation of non-financial disclosures as a part of the accounting framework itself. So as we move forward in that direction, these ESG criteria will come within the purview of financial reporting itself, because it has financial material. So today's ESG indicators are going to be financial indicators in future, because there is going to be more and more evidence of relationship between the two. So yeah, I think that's how things are moving, and I'm sure it will move exactly in the same fashion in India as well. I'll pass it over to Akansha.
Yeah,
Akansha.
yeah, sure. So I just want to add on this. Of course, this is a shared responsibility, and since I mean I come from a startup, so it's like even harder for us to maintain and manage everything with limited resources. But yes, of course, we get lots of support from our investor companies who guide us in the right direction, while also making the efforts on doing multiple researches, because this is a novel area. We are finding out methods help solve this particular problem. There is no traditional way to this. And if whatever is difficult now, if we can make it easier in the next few years or so with the help of technology, which we are expert at or which we are very enthusiastic at, then that will help solve the problem. That's
Got it. No, thanks. I guess there's two other key areas that I want to move on to. First is just relating to public policy, and this has been touched upon throughout the discussion. There's, I mean, huge changes both in India and globally around more favorable regulation and climate change. I mean, when you think about India, I mean, for instance, the extended producer responsibility norms requiring corporates to better manage all waste, but primarily plastic waste, or Raj, as you mentioned, BRSR reporting for Indian public companies is a huge part. I think from the perspective of India versus global, as well as just which particular government policies in India are particularly relevant here, I mean, are there any ones that you would point to, and are there any upcoming policies that we should be expecting? I mean, there's obviously a lot going on in places like carbon markets and zero liquid discharge on the water side that are not sort of directly, okay, this is emissions related. Anything we should be looking out for, and any comments on just what's happened already in terms of government regulation?
Okay, maybe just, we were part of this, I think a few months ago, the G20, I think did a good job, honestly, where a lot of the new a few of the policies were reconfirmed. I think there was a lot of good talk on biofuels. I think the role of digital, I think this is the core of our topic here, the analytics, which ties very close with digital was a big part of it. I think those were some, and I think there was a reaffirmation of the net zeros goals. I think if you look at, so we did a very interesting exercise inside our firm. So if you look at net zero, which are the industries that need to really shift, and then we looked at where is the inflection point for certain solutions, purely from an investor mindset. And it was fascinating. It cuts across multiple segments, Akash. I think there's a lot of policies on e-mobility. I think there's a goal of 30% of all vehicles to be electric. We are like about 10% of that. So if you, from an investor mindset, it's a 10x. So we as an investor, you have to also think about the commercial excitement. I think the construction industry, in my opinion, is going to go through a fairly meaningful transition to a lower energy transition, because about 40% of emissions are resident in the built environment. I think those are two. And the last one I would say is an increasing focus on supply chain. I think, honestly, when you talk about net zero, the most fundamental assessment is the scope 3 emissions. That's 80% of emissions actually are in the supply chain, 80%, not a small number. So I think we are looking at multiple companies using AI, machine learning, ML to find ways to build the analytics into an action intelligence. So those are some of the sectors I feel are ripe for impact, Akash, and we are looking at them. It's in our pipeline. I can tell you how many deals we have in the pipeline, which speak just to the 2 or 3 things I spoke about.
Yep, definitely. And I mean, even some of these government regulations can form as catalysts to particular new companies emerging and
Absolutely.
adoption for them. And that has
Absolutely.
actually formed part of the investment rationale for some of our companies. Akanksha, Anupam, any views on this?
I mean, I'll be quick. I think the most groundbreaking, progress which we can make is if India, creates something called as our own green taxonomy, or the definition of how do you define a business as green versus brown. Because right now it's very difficult to define which business is green versus which business is brown, and that's what the whole EU taxonomy did in Europe. So I'm sure that a Indian taxonomy is due, and I'm sure regulators are working on this area. And the moment it comes out, it will create a lot of buzz, and it will also open a lot of opportunities. At the same time, financial institutions will have to relook into their existing portfolios as well as decide the way forward.
Got it.
Just to add one more point, like Akash, there has to be certain standardizations on the data collection part, not only from the industrial input side or the manual way which we are doing right now in the GHG inventarization, but also from the ambient to exactly map out what has been taken, the initiatives inside the corporations.
Makes sense. And I guess that leads to this last point that is open for all, which is look, I mean, when we think about investment opportunities and just sort of the path forward, what is sort of some of the most exciting use cases of this data? And I think as Raj, we were discussing in earlier on, it's much more of a horizontal than a vertical, right? You're not investing that much in climate data analytics, but really you're looking at businesses that are incorporating it into their businesses. And this spans across verticals. I mean, everything from carbon markets to water to energy transition. So, I mean, what are some of the most exciting opportunities you guys are seeing in related verticals that can really incorporate climate data to have large impactful solutions?
Right. So maybe I think I like the word related, Akash. So I'll give an example of one of our companies, which 5 years ago, I would struggle to make a case of climate analytics, but this is how fast the industry is evolving. So I think this is in the food and agri space, which is not something that comes to mind when you think of climate analytics. But so we have a company that tries to work on the climate adaptation. So basically, they do a lot of research and development on this, hybrid seeds, which make the crops more resilient to. So last year, if because of the extreme heat, there are certain crops like tomato, for example, 40% of those crops were decimated because of one variable alone, which was extreme heat. So I think they've been using, honestly, very impressively, a lot of data analytics to figure out how to tinker and do improve the profile, not through what is that? Not GMO, that's banned in India. Because I think India doesn't follow GMO methodologies, but there are ways to do it in a hybrid way, in a non-GMO way, where you improve the resiliency of the crops. So effectively, the next crop of tomato, maybe next year, using the seeds of this company, will be a lot more resilient to the extreme heat, to less water. I think that's oftenly an ignored aspect of climate usage, Akash, where it's not just about reducing carbon, because the car's going to hit the wall anyway. I mean, so how do you make the businesses more resilient? I think that's a little bit of a nuanced understanding that at least our team has been seeing is, it's not just about reduction of carbon, but how to make the businesses survive on the impact that's going to happen regardless of what we do. So that's just an example I thought was worth sharing.
Got it. Appreciate it. Akanksha, Anupam, what are some of the most exciting places you see climate data analytics being used, particular verticals, applications, anything like that?
So I guess like one of the most important factors, the like simulation assessment tools, which will be derived from lots amount of data once we collect the on-ground data. So what it can show is, like, for example, you can put up certain scenarios and it can provide you the details of the climate risks, what is going to happen and what actions you can take against them. So this is something which we have been working because we have been collecting lots of data, and which coupled with the satellite data and whatever ambient information we have, so it's actually creating quite a good value. But we have been able to do the forecasting since, for example, for next 10 or 15 years, but we are working on how to increase the reliability to even like 100 years, for the next 100 years.
Interesting.
I can add very quickly, Akash. I think one key area which I see where climate analytics can be used is portfolio optimization. So traditional portfolio, optimization or creation of portfolios are use mostly financial parameters or return parameters, but incorporating more and more ESG indicators in the portfolio optimization itself would be the real integration of ESG data in the decision made by financial institutions. And we have already started doing that. Carbon, for example, is being used by a lot of financial institutions to optimize their portfolio, to exclude certain stocks, to focus on certain sectors. But I think more broader integration has to be done. Indicators such as biodiversity, water, in Indian context, water is definitely very important indicator. So I think portfolio optimization, integration of ESG portfolio optimization is going to be really the next stage.
Got it. Yeah, and then we're seeing it particularly relevant in certain places around the energy transition when you think about sort of optimizing the efficiency of solar assets, for instance, or in a completely different vertical when you're thinking about carbon markets and just the data coming out of it. It's quite hard to assess, and should we get better data, potentially we can make more actionable and honestly more accurate assessments as to what that looks like. I think that concludes what we had. There are a couple of questions that are coming in. Akriti, I can kind of just go through some of them, and then anyone, I would say, just because of time, if only one person wants to provide a response, that'd be great. So starting with Sarthak from Huddle. In India, traditional industries suffer from a lack of primary data sets. What do you think about solving computation of primary data sets beyond ERP data that So basically I think it's relating to the lack of primary data sets, and how do you think about solving for that? And I think one of the answers Akanksha would probably give is to start building up new primary data sets. But any other thoughts there?
Yeah, I can add to this question, Akash. And I briefly touched upon this, that since we have a lot of data for companies who have already disclosed, who might belong to the same sector or business activity, we use machine learning and AI models to predict the data for the companies which we don't have any disclosures. So this is one key application which we have been able to implement because we already have gathered a lot of information, and we have the right training data set to train these machine learning models, the data which is not available. So basically what we are doing is we are estimating non-financial data using financial data, using the machine learning models. And that is a temporary sort of a gap filling exercise because financial institutions need this data today. And it also adds a pressure on the investing company that we are using estimated data for you as of today, but can you please start capturing this information going forward? So yeah, this is definitely feasible, and we are already doing it.
Makes sense. Second is Neelam want to ask the VCs, what are the steps to ensure the climate tech startups reach Series A, B, and are able to scale product-wise and/or geography along with product innovation? So perhaps I can take it, and then would love to hear your answer from the growth side of things. Firstly, the comment is spot on, because what we're seeing is a gap in this Series A, pre-Series A stage, wherein taking companies to really scale to the next level. We look at global technologies, trying to scale them in India, as well as taking Indian companies and scaling globally. one of the biggest things we've learned and also understand is that climate problems don't stop at borders, right? Unlike country borders, these are global problems. They require global solutions. What's necessary to scale these companies outside of just capital is really working with them. We touched on it earlier around working with companies to understand the full supply chain, understand second, third order consequences of their solution, and also certain bottlenecks or capacity constraints at scale. And so I think in VC, at least, we always want to think about, look, how do you use sort of minimal dollars to achieve maximal impact and also financial returns? And so helping companies at an early stage is key. I think ecosystem provider and corporates are a key aspect within climate. Many of these companies are either working with larger corporates on pilots or testing their solutions or helping them scale up. And partnerships are really a key part of it. We help try and make some of those connections. And then lastly, we sort of, I mean, in terms of just the investor ecosystem right now, this is getting a lot of capital, both from generalists as well as climate specific funds like GEF and ourselves and many others. And so really connecting people with capital that can be helpful both on the strategic side as well as investor side is how we aim to take these companies to then the growth guys who will then do their thing. Would love to hear just your thoughts on what you think about.
You said the right word, Akash, is the ecosystem. So my view is very strongly that any kind of capital, VCP, you name it, is still a very hugely positive trickle-down effect at all aspects of the value chain. The reason I say that is, I remember in 2009 when we launched our first climate fund. All of the entrepreneurs were first-time experimental. Most of them were experimental entrepreneurs because this was a new sector. So my point here is, do not ignore the value of human capital, right? I mean, VCs or PE, we can bring the financial capital. There are three legs to the stool. The second is human capital. Third is the technology. So today I can tell you with a lot of evidence that the 10 companies we saw 13 years ago, at least 100 companies today. The reason for that is people recycle, the senior leadership, they go. I mean, if you look at, I'll just be a little bit off here, but if you look at the top 10 companies in renewable, you will see like at least 7 of them have very common, parentage, they all came from. So I think my point is, this is a sector that needs a lot more capital, be it VCP, buyout, it doesn't matter. Honestly, I think the more capital goes into this critical sector, some will fail, some will succeed, but it will create a very credible human capital pool, which I think is, so I think everybody has to play a role here. I would not put this in a VC versus PE, but the human capital is probably the most important. You need experienced entrepreneurs who have failed, who have succeeded. Everything is ecosystem, Akash. That's the key word.
Agreed. Akriti, I think we have a last question, but it's related to the investment opportunities, which I think we had all touched upon. But thank you very much. This was a really interesting discussion. I'll hand it over to IVCA for sort of closing. You're on mute.
Sorry. Thanks a lot, speakers, for taking your time and sharing your experiences. All the day-to-day use cases very relevant and touch upon so many things. For the entire climate data analytics theme. But this is not the end. We'll be coming up with many such initiatives. The next in line is on single-use plastic. But at some point of time, we'll again come back to data analytics, and we'll love to hear from you even then, because as Samir also mentioned that it's a continuous evolving space, and there cannot be a point where you have enough data and you say, okay, we'll start from here. So that may not happen. So we'll have to touch upon this particular topic multiple times a year. Thanks a lot once again, everyone. And we'll reach out to you soon for our next session. In case. Yeah.
Thanks. Yes. No, I'm getting a lot of messages on the sidelines. So people are saying we should have more of such sessions and more detailed ones. So we'll be reaching out to you guys very, very soon.
Thank you.
Great. Thanks for organizing.
Thanks, Samir. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thanks.